The Barton Foundation was an influential group that sought to expand their power no matter the consequences. As a result, they were one of the few who wanted to follow through with the original Operation Meteor. This consisted of dropping a colony onto the Earth, wiping out most of its population, therefore allowing the 5 Gundams to take control over the planet. These 5 Gundams were the Transformable Wing Gundam, the Stealthy Gundam Dead Scythe, the Armored Gundam Sandrock, the Close Combat Shenlong Gundam, and finally the Gundam that was made with the funding of the Barton Foundation themselves, the Long Range Gundam Heavyarms. Developed by the expert in ballistic weaponry Dr. S, its arsenal would consist almost exclusively of conventional weapons. In its head it had a Vulcan gun, which was only powerful enough to damage targets with little armor or to provide suppressive fire. On the clavicles there were 2 more powerful machine cannons, which were often used together with the Vulcans for that suppressive fire. On the chest it had a pair of 8-barreled chest Gatling guns. In each shoulder there were 6 homing missiles, and on each leg was a missile pod containing 12 micro-missiles. But unlike the homing missiles, these weren't guided. The single beam weapon then that it originally had was also its signature weapon, the 6-barreled beam Gatling gun. This weapon combines a Gatling gun with a shield, and when in use it slides over the left arm. And for additional accuracy when firing, it has an extra handle that can be held with the right hand, although there are no records of this feature ever being used in live combat. The Heavyarms focused more on overwhelming firepower than accuracy after all. And when not in use, it could be stored on the backpack. So as long as the Heavyarms had ammo, it was an extremely powerful mobile suit. But even when it was seemingly empty, it still had one final trick up its sleeve. Mounted on the right arm was a Gundanium army knife that was powerful enough to easily cut through enemy mobile suits. It was rather short, but this didn't seem like too much of a problem for its pilot, Troa Barton. And on top of that, the knife was even powerful enough to stop a beam blade from a fellow Gundam. And despite all of this weaponry, the Gundam Heavyarms was surprisingly agile, especially when used by a pilot who knew what he was doing. Originally though, the Heavyarms was assigned to another Troa Barton, who was the son of Dakin Barton, and someone who was most likely only chosen out of nepotism. He was braggadocious and a staunch believer in the original Operation Meteor. Dr. S, on the other hand, and the same went for the other Gundam engineers, weren't. They were all for Operation Meteor, being about taking revenge for the assassination of Hiro Yui, but they weren't really in favor of killing millions and billions of innocent civilians to achieve this goal. As a result, their targets would be restricted to Oz military facilities. For Troa and the Barton Foundation though, the revenge part of Operation Meteor was just a sideshow, as they wanted to conquer the whole Earth sphere, no matter how many people on Earth would die as a result. In the end though, the only casualty of this original plan would be Troa himself. While he was talking about the plan to Dr. S, another engineer was also present. This man had a family on Earth, and fearing for their safety, he decided to do the only thing that he could do.
Now you've done it.
And they had another stroke of good luck. Also overhearing them was a nameless engineer who was actually a former mercenary. This no-name was willing to take over both Troa's role and name, and was okay to go along with the modified version of the operation. And so, in After Colony 195, 5 Gundams would descend to Earth, signaling the start of Operation Meteor. At first, everything was going well, but it wouldn't take long before Oz would turn the tables on the Gundam pilots, something that would even result in the Wing Gundam self-destructing, and its pilot, Hiro Yui, being seriously wounded. Troa would save Hiro, and would later on also lend him his mobile suit to fight against his arch-nemesis, Zechs Marquise. And this is where we get the first small modification made to the Heavyarms. The way the controls were set up was that the joysticks were stiffer relative to how heavy that side of the Gundam was. So the left joystick, which controlled the left arm with the beam Gatling gun, was significantly harder to move than the right joystick. And it just so happened that Hiro's left arm was more injured than his right arm, creating a big handicap. In response, Troa modified the left arm so that not only the beam Gatling gun could be jettisoned, which it was actually designed to do, but the entire lower arm as well. This would make the machine significantly lighter and would also reveal a hidden beam saber, which could then be used by the right arm. After this one duel though, this feature would be never used again, so it is sometimes speculated that after the duel, Troa removed this feature and returned his heavy arms to its stock configuration. Later into the war then, the heavy arms would be upgraded to the Heavy Arms Custom. Although compared to some of the other Gundams, this was a rather small upgrade. To make it better suited for combat in space, it got extra thrusters on the backpack and extra verniers on the skirt armor. For extra firepower, the beam Gatling gun was upgraded to a twin beam Gatling gun, and, well, that was it. At least for the TV version. But before we get to the Endless Waltz version and its variants, we first have to go over to other Heavy Arms variants that weren't made. While the Heavy Arms Custom was designed for combat in space, these two variants were made for combat on Earth. For aerial combat, there was the Gundam Sky High Arms, and for land combat, there was the Gundam Super Armed Tank. So for the Gundam Sky High Arms, the idea was to turn the Heavy Arms into a mobile suit-shaped bomber. And rather than turning it into something resembling an aircraft, it got a giant booster that was powerful enough to deliver the Heavy Arms and all of its weapons to the enemy base, where the plan would then seemingly consist of 3 phases. In Phase 1, the Sky High Arms would attack the base from the sky. In Phase 2, it would land and take out the enemies while being on the ground, and then in Phase 3, it would retreat over land while using its remaining weapons. So to me, it sounds like when it goes from Phase 1 to Phase 2, it ditches the booster, because in Phase 3, it has to do the Walk of Shame home. As for the weapons then, it still has the same Vulcan guns, machine cannons, chest Gatling guns, and seemingly also the 6 homing missiles, but the leg-mounted micro-missile pods have been replaced with missile pods carrying 5 larger missiles, potentially being of the same type as the shoulder-mounted homing missiles. The beam Gatling has had its armor streamlined, potentially for better aerodynamics, and it now has one over the right arm as well. And finally, the booster itself has 12 missiles mounted onto the wings. And for extra mobility while flying, it also got extra boosters on its side skirts. So simply put, this was the Heavy Arms with a booster and slightly more weapons. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum then, we've got the Gundam Super Armed Tank. This massive behemoth was designed to push the Heavy Arms' concept of heavy firepower to the limit, and therefore kept almost nothing of the original Heavy Arms. Its arms were replaced with missile pods containing 16 small missiles, 3 homing missiles, and 2 machine cannons, which could also rotate independently from the missile pods. And then as additional stuff, on the right pod, there were also 3 cannons and a beam claw arm, and on the left pod, we have an extra missile pod and a crusher arm. All of this made the machine so heavy that it needed to be mounted on tank treads instead. And of course, another side effect was that the super armed tank was also super slow. Way too slow for a Gundam in fact, so this machine was never built. And I like that it's only the super armed tank that is said to have never been built, because that kinda implies that the Sky High Arms was built. And this was all for the TV version of the Heavy Arms. But like I said before, there was also the Endless Waltz version, which got used in the Endless Waltz movie, the Glory of the Losers manga, and the Frozen Teardrop light novel. As with all of the Endless Waltz designs, Story-wise, there aren't any drastic changes worth mentioning, but what did change was the equipment, with the biggest change being the amount of missiles that it carried. It now had 44 homing missiles stored in the leg-mounted missile pods and front skirts, and 52 micro-missiles in the shoulders and side skirts. Smaller changes then are that the army knife is now an optional piece of equipment, and that the beam Gatling gun also got a redesign. It is made larger, it is handheld instead of sliding over the arm, it's powered by an energy tank on its backpack, and the shield is now optional and can be mounted on either the Gatling gun itself or on one of the forearms. The head Vulcans, machine cannons, and chest Gatlings remained the same, but the opening armor plates covering the chest Gatlings did get slightly overhauled. In the TV version, the armor covering the cockpit hatch also opens up, but in the Endless Waltz version, it doesn't. And in case it needed even more firepower, the Endless Waltz version also got the Eagle unit. This add-on pack came with 12 4-tube missile launchers per shoulder, with 3 facing to the back, 3 facing to the front, and 6 facing to the side, so they could be easily launched at wherever the enemy was. The legs got an extra missile pod each, containing 20 additional missiles each, and it also got a large beam cannon that had to be mounted on a trailer. It was extremely powerful, but this was also its main drawback. The barrel couldn't handle the massive output, and the weapon was out of commission after just a single shot. And to compensate for all of these weapons, it also got a high-speed crawler unit, which did not only speed up the heavy arms, but they also allowed it to fire all of its weapons while dashing around. And every piece of this equipment could also be instantly ditched thanks to explosive bolts. Another piece of equipment then seems to have been somewhat inspired by the sky-high arms, the Damsel fly equipment. This was an atmospheric flight unit for the heavy arms that had 2 6-bladed propellers and 2 auxiliary jet engines. It was designed not to get in the way of its main weapons, and because it added a lot of weight to the top of the machine, it also had an extendable support leg in the middle for when it landed. When it was time for the heavy arms to be upgraded to the Heavy Arms Custom then, the changes depend on which version of the Endless Waltz version you're looking at. In the Endless Waltz movie, the only thing that was changed about the mobile suit itself was its color scheme, with the real big changes being made to the weapons. But in the Glory of the Losers manga, it follows the TV version with upgraded thrusters on the backpack and new ones on the back skirt. But what they have of course mostly in common are the upgrades done to the weapons. The head Vulcans, machine cannons, and missile launchers remained the same, but it now has 4 chest-mounted Gatling guns instead of 2, and the 1 single-barrel beam Gatling gun was now replaced by 2 double-barreled Gatling guns, effectively quadrupling their firepower. They no longer had the shield, and when not in use, they could still be stored on the backpack. What isn't known though is if these are conventional weapons or beam weapons. Different sources say different things, and in the anime, we also see shell cases falling when the weapon is fired. However, it is also possible that these shells came from the Serpents, so let's take a little detour here. The development of the Serpent was carried out by members of the former United Earthsphere Alliance in the X-18999 colony. They wanted to make a successor to the Leo, and at the same time, they also wanted to keep up with the Derringer faction, who was mass-producing mobile dolls on the moon. Supposedly, the colony was all too happy to accommodate this R&D, and even wanted the production lines to be built in the colony. This was because one of the big backers of the project was the Barton Foundation, who probably also had a very large influence in X-18999. But the war would be over before these new Serpents could be deployed. And this is then where the Barton Foundation again stepped in. They took over the colony, finished the development of the Serpent, and began secretly mass-producing it, preparing for their war against the Earthsphere Unified Nation. Most of the Serpent remained the same, but the Barton Foundation did modify its weapons to be closer to that of their other main mobile suit, the Heavyarms. And the important weapon here is of course the double Gatling gun. This weapon also isn't specified as a beam weapon or a conventional weapon, and is said to be mostly identical to the one used by the Heavyarms. So it is entirely possible that the Serpents are using a cheaper conventional version, which is then where the bullets on screen came from, while the Heavyarms custom uses a beam version. Or maybe it had one pair of each, and Troa could just choose which version to use before each mission. And because it now uses 2 of these Gatling guns, one on each arm, the army knife on the right arm had to go, eliminating all close-range combat capabilities that it had. But apparently in the novel version, it did still have the army knife. In the Glory of the Looters manga then, it could also be seen with the Taurus' laser gun. This gun wasn't as powerful as a beam rifle, but it could punch through the electromagnetic field that was generated by the Virgo's planet defensors. And its final features then were a self-destruct system, which was powerful enough to blow up the mobile suit itself as well as anything else in its surrounding area, and a mobile suit-sized clown mask. It doesn't do anything by itself, but it might have a psychological effect on enemy pilots with choleraphobia. And in DTL's Impulse manga, this heavy firepower Gundam would also get a mass production version built by the Rockefeller Foundation. This machine was called the Derringer Arms, and it seems to have been mostly the same as the Heavyarms custom, with the most obvious difference being its color scheme, which was inspired by the colors of the original Heavyarms. Other differences are that the lower arms are taken from either the Mercurius or the V8, and that it no longer has the V-fin, making its sensors weaker. This was done as a cost-saving measure because the Derringer Arms was intended mostly as like a last line of defense for the capital, as opposed to a mobile suit that would be flying around, actively searching for the enemy. As for weapons, we don't have too much information. We know that it only has a single double Gatling gun instead of 2, but we don't know if the other weapons have remained the same or if they were also simplified for mass production. Many years later then, during the events of the Frozen Teardrop light novels, 4 mobile suits made out of Gundanium alloy would be found in a hangar on an old resource satellite owned by the Winner family. These machines were supposedly used during the Second Lunar War and were built at some point between the creation of the Wing Zero and the 5 Gundams that were used during Operation Meteor. The problem was that they were in pretty bad shape and would need some extensive work to be usable again. So 2 of them would be restored by Katra, now going under the pseudonym Instructor W, and 2 of them would be restored by Troa, now going under the pseudonym Dr. T. And one of the machines that he restored was the Prometheus, a machine that heavily resembles the Heavyarms. But before he could finish his work, the machine was stolen by Catherine Odd Winner, who then also became the main pilot of the Prometheus. However, it was only 80% completed, so its appearance was very shoddy, with quite some armor panels missing. But at least its weapons seemed to be mostly complete. It had a lot of missile launchers all over its body, just like the Heavyarms, and as its main weapon, it had a giant cross-shaped composite weapon system that housed Gatling guns and missile launchers. And as finishing touches, it also had the clown mask and a nano defender cloak for extra protection. And that is where the development history of the Heavyarms ends for now. A mobile suit that is very true to its name, with a lot of heavy armaments. So let me know down below which one is your favorite variant, and what your favorite color scheme for the Heavyarms is. Its red and orange color scheme is super iconic and my personal favorite, but there's definitely a case to be made for the more realistic blue and green color scheme that we saw in Endless Waltz. As always, a big thank you to the Patreon supporters. I hope everyone watching has a great day, and I'll see you all next time.